Well, let me first of all say that it's an enormous pleasure to be in Vancouver, and it's a very great honour to be asked to give this lecture in memory of one of the great figures in the fight for a public sphere in communications. And it's also, I have to say, an enormous relief to be in what we are now urged to call the United States of Canada, which includes your fine country and the thin, pitifully thin strips down both coasts of the United States that voted for Kerry. As you will probably notice, you won't now because the slides changed, but a lot of people think I must be related to Rupert Murdock. He does know who I am. In fact, he was rumoured once to say that he would never allow me in any of the buildings that he owns. But the last time I gave such an address as this, the venue was the Royal Society of Engineers building in London, a very splendid building. And around the ceiling they have little statues of the great engineers, one of whom I'm very proud to say was one of my ancestors. It's the man who invented domestic gas lighting. And I was on a very powerful platform with two cabinet ministers. And I was trying to think of a way to introduce what I was going to say because I knew they wouldn't want to hear it. And so I said, well, you probably think I'm related to Rupert Murdock, but I'm not. I said, but I see you do have a statue of my ancestor. I think I can honestly say that my family have brought more enlightenment to the public than Rupert's. You may revise your opinion after you've heard what I've got to say. I'd like to begin with three quotations which I've put up on the overhead. The first comes from Joan Bakewell, who entered the BBC in 1954 as a trainee and has recently retired. She was one of the great figures of the BBC's great era of television all through the 60s and the 70s. And you'll see that that's a statement of regret. Her recent autobiography is a long regret for the passing of something that she was proud of. You'll see also a statement there by Robert James Walker. Again, many broadcasters of that generation would share that sentiment, that they were involved in something great, but it's gone. But the last quotation comes from one of Britain's best political theorists, David Marquand. It is time to retrieve, or perhaps to reinvent, the public domain. And that's really the theme of what I'm going to say. I think it's particularly important to say it now, and it's particularly important for a political economist to say it, since we've inherited the mantle of economics as being the dismal science. And I have to say I've made my money being one of the most pessimistic commentators you could possibly imagine. In fact, if I would come to a meeting and find somebody more pessimistic than myself, I would try and outdo them by thinking of something even more miserablest to say about the way the world was going. And let's not underestimate what it is that's happening. Certainly in Britain and in many other countries I'm familiar with, the last 2 decades have been a disaster for public television. You've had a great sweeping chorus of people singing the last rites of an institution which they now consider to be well past its sell-by date, and arguing more and more vociferously for a wholly commercialised system. They argue that the licence fee is an unacceptable curb on consumer freedom. In fact, they argue that almost any taxation is an unacceptable curb on consumer freedom. And they argue very vociferously for the right to be allowed to make as much money as possible with as little responsibility as possible. And they've made considerable inroads. And that accounts for the pessimism of broadcasters of Joan's generation. But I actually want to argue the opposite case tonight. I want to argue that this pessimism is misplaced, and that we now stand at a historic point of opportunity, and that far from being something that is on the way out, or can be put in a box, a little bit of decoration in a commercialised environment, I want to argue that public service broadcasting is a project whose time has only just now finally come. And I want to argue with David Marquardt that we do need to reinvent the public domain. And we need this more than ever because of the massive increase in individualism and commercialism that now dominates and defines our cultural landscape. But I want to argue that this reinvention has to take a new perspective. Most of the thinking on broadcasting up until now has been dominated by what I call an analogue map of the world. Because analogue technologies were largely incompatible with one another, what we're familiar with is a cultural landscape that is divided into very recognisable domains, cultural industries. So you still go to the record store to buy a record, you still go to the bookstore to buy a book, you still go to the cinema to watch movies, you still go to a discotheque to dance. We're used to these separations, and broadcasting has seen itself always as another pillar in this great collection of skyscrapers. But a digital map would require us to knock that whole downtown area to the ground and start again. And I want to argue that the opportunity that broadcasting faces, and that public broadcasting faces particularly, is that for the first time we have the chance to make a practical working coalition between broadcasting, public institutions, and a whole series of civil initiatives, and that the key to that is using the internet in a creative way. But before I get on to that, it's very important to sketch in some of the background, because one of the great impediments to this is the baggage that we all carry with us from the past. Those of you who believe that the past is finished, I recommend you, if you haven't already, to read the front page of today's Globe and Mail. It features a magnificent story about Prince Charles, our heir to the throne. And I have to say, as someone who has Scottish ancestry, I've been a Republican since I broke my coronation mark at the age of 5. This is Charles. What is wrong with people nowadays? Why do they all seem to think they're qualified